about 11,000 years before Christ. In the area we call the Middle East, something is beginning to happen that will change the human race. A change begins after which it will never be the same again. The climate provided us with the preconditions for this change. About 20,000 years ago, the era begins to end when a good part of the planet Earth was bound by ice. It is a cold and dry world. Only in the area around the tropical climate is a pleasant climate. At the height of that era, in the last glacial maximum, about 30% of the Earth was covered with ice. About 18,000 BC, global warming begins. The change of ice ages and warming is probably related to the movement of the planet Earth along its orbit and the position of the Earth's axis. Global warming was not a uniform process. The Ice Age returned somewhere around 12,000 BC and lasted for around 10,000 BC. Then the last great Ice Age finally ended. And then that change began, that revolution in people's way of life, after which nothing will be the same. A large part of the history of the human race was marked by a lifestyle called hunter-gatherer. In 2002, archaeologist Michelle Brunet found the skeleton of a creature that could be our earliest ancestor in the Chadian desert at the site of Toros Manala. The creature was named Sahelanthropus chadensis. Its remains are 6 to 7 million years old. That creature was most likely a bipedal hominid. From that earliest ancestor until the end of the last ice age, hominid life did not change much. They were hunter-gatherers. Food came from hunting, carrion and plants. These people often moved from one seasonal hunting ground to another, from one food source to another. They didn't have many things. Their communities were small. There was hardly any history there. Human history began somewhere around 50,000 BC, or somewhere around that date, maybe around 100,000 BC, but certainly not before that. Human evolution has a much longer history. At least 3 billion years have passed since the beginning of life. And about 6 million years have passed since our lineage separated from the chimpanzee lineage. History is the cumulative development of knowledge and events, all of which happened recently and is incredibly short. Little of importance happened until 20,000 years before Christ. Humans have lived as hunter-gatherers, just as their ancestors have for millions of years. They lived in small communities and never stayed in one place for long. A few cave walls were painted, and some nice hunting weapons were made, but there were no events that influenced the course of history that created the modern world. Then came, after 15,000 BC, classical Greece, the Industrial Revolution, the Atomic Age, the Internet. It failed to reach the significance of those events. If it is 50,000 the year before Christ marked the birth of history, the year 20,000 up to 5,000 before Christ were her maturation. Homo sapiens, the wise man, was our first ancestor who changed way of life. Then humanids no longer just cruised the landscape and looked for food. They began to extend their stay in one place, first for several weeks, then months. In the area of the Fertile Crescent, people began to exploit wild grasses and grains. This dietary change can be dated around 21,000 BC. Its earliest traces were found on the territory of today's Israel. The first communities appear that live mainly in one place, and in their diet more places are occupied by wild grasses and cereals. Then the climate got involved and life in the Fertile Crescent began to change again. It seems that people who began to depend on gathering wild grains at the end of the Pleistocene, they found themselves faced with longer hot summers and increased drought, which reduced the natural production of these vital resources. To compensate for this, the Fertile Crescent people initiated the processes of cultivation and artificial selection 11,000 to 10,000 years ago. They planted the seeds of wild grains such as einkorn and emmer, which stored their seeds best during harvest and had those seeds gathered in bunches. The cultivation of first wild cereals, then vetch and wild flax, which were used to make clothes, did not mark the beginning of agriculture. In Oahu, located in the north of Israel, which dates back to 18,000 BC, traces of such a settlement were found, inhabited by people whose diet consists largely of cereals and legumes. But the people who lived in Oahu had not yet crossed the doorstep of no return. The doorstep was crossed in a culture called the Natufian culture. In the late 1930s, archaeologist Dorothy Garrett explored a site in a dry valley called Wadi Nadaf. The valley is located in the hills in today's northern Israel. The objects found were similar to those found in Paleolithic sites, but something was different. First, among the tools made from broken stones were a number of small blades, blunt on one side and polished on the sharp side. Second, many large mortars and grinding stones were found. Third, the settlement Dorothy excavated in Wadi Nadaf extended well beyond the cave entrance. The inhabitants built the dwellings in which they lived. It was clearly a much larger settlement than any other Paleolithic settlement. In the end, more than 100 burials were found in the cemetery. The tools found at that site were similar to other Paleolithic tools, but those small stones with one polished blade were different from anything that had been found before. They were stone sickle blades. This sharpening tool would be inserted into the wooden handle, and the grain would be harvested with it. Grinders and grinding stones have been found elsewhere, in the Fertile Crescent, but nowhere else have so many been found. The grinding equipment was made of black basalt. Its sites were 10 kilometers away from the settlement, and a number of stone vessels and mortars were decorated with an incised geometric pattern. All this indicated that the appearance of the Natufian culture, which spread throughout Palestine and South Syria, was at the transition from hunter-gatherer to farming, and there was no turning back from that path. People of the Natufian culture were not exclusively engaged in farming and did not live permanently in one place, but they were probably among the first to embark on the journey towards a sedentary lifestyle and farming. This progress brought them larger dwellings. Some of them were made of limestone, which indicated that the dwellings were built for a longer period. The settlements were larger. There were more and more tools. There were areas for storing food. Women wove rugs and baskets. It was a step that had to be taken in order to fulfill the prerequisites for a sedentary lifestyle. 9,000 years ago, goats and sheep were domesticated in the Middle East. Hundreds of years later, cattle were domesticated. The first fortified settlements in the Middle East were built before 8500. The age of a sedentary lifestyle, the age of agriculture and animal husbandry began. It was the biggest revolution in the history of mankind. When a man started on that path, there was no turning back from it.